Okay, well, there we are. So welcome everybody to our conference lesson once again. My name is Alistair. It is my pleasure to take you through today's conference presentation. And today it's about some of our modal verbs. The lesson is called Modals in English, expressing possibility, probability, and obligation. So 3 functions of language: possibility, probability, and obligation. Now, let us begin. Here we go. So here is our agenda for the lesson today. 4 parts to it. Number 1, what are modal verbs? Number 2, expressing possibility. Number 3, expressing probability. And number 4, expressing obligation. Okay. So our suggestion for you is to please find a pen and a notebook so you are ready to take notes to check later during our lesson today. Of course, you are able to take screenshots as well, no problem. And of course, you will be able to see the lesson at a later date as well on our replay function. So first of all, what are modal verbs? So number 1, modal verbs are auxiliary verbs that modify the meaning of the main verb to express a function, possibility, necessity, or permission. Number 2, common modal verbs include can, could, may, might, must, shall, should, will, and would. These are most of the modal verbs in English, but they are auxiliary. They are the support verb to the main verb in a sentence. Number 3, they are used to add nuance and clarity to statements, and they can really enhance the quality of our language. So they are used to add nuance and clarity to statements. Well, let's think about conjugation. Wow. Modal verbs do not change form. There is no conjugation. For example, there's no S in the third person. We don't conjugate them in a verb tense. Number 2, they are followed by the base form of the main verb, or the bare infinitive. Number 3, there is a formula for their structure. We use a subject plus the modal verb plus the base verb. For example, she can swim. Okay, so this sentence, it expresses a function. It expresses the ability of the girl. She can swim. So let's think about when they are used. So number 1, to show ability, can, possibility, might, permission, may, or obligation, must. Okay, so let me read through number 1 again. To show ability, can, possibility, might, permission, may, or obligation, must. Number 2, to make polite requests, could, would. To make polite requests, could, would. And number 3, to express speculation or probability, might, must. To express speculation or probability, might, must. Well, here are a couple of tips when it comes to using modal verbs. Number 1, remember, modal verbs do not have past or future forms, but combine with other words to express time. Number 2, Practice using them in common scenarios to improve fluency. Okay, so 2 very good tips there. Remember, modal verbs do not have past or future forms. They don't change, but combine with other words to express time. Number 2, practice using them in common scenarios to improve fluency. So how do British people use them? How do British people use them in natural ways? So number 1, British English often uses modal verbs for politeness, of course. E.g., could you pass the salt? So British English often uses modal verbs for politeness. Could you pass the salt? Number 2, they are commonly used in conditional sentences and formal contexts. Okay, this is true. Number 2, they are commonly used in conditional sentences and formal contexts. Well, let's start with the first function for today, which is possibility. So expressing possibility. Here are some modal verbs for possibility. Can, could, may, and might. Explanation and usage. Can, used for general possibility. For example, it can rain in April. It's possible. It can rain in April. Could, suggests a weaker possibility or something hypothetical. For example, it could be true. It is possible. May, indicates formal or strong possibility. For example, it may snow tomorrow. It's a strong possibility. And might, expresses uncertainty. For example, she might come to the party. It's uncertain. Okay, so there we go. Let's continue and have a look at expressing possibility. A tip. Use might and could for less certain situations and may for more formal or likely scenarios. So a good tip for expressing possibility. Use might and could for less certain situations and may for more formal likely scenarios. Well, let's have a look at some examples. Here we go. I'll read through each of these twice. We might see a movie tonight if we finish early. We might see a movie tonight if we finish early. We may talk to the boss later if we have time. We may talk to the boss later if we have time. A real life situation, planning a weekend trip. We could visit the park if the weather is nice. We could visit the park if the weather is nice. Okay, well, let's think about the next function here, which is probability, expressing probability. Modal verbs for probability: must, should, ought to, and could. Explanation and usage. Must indicates strong probability or logical certainty. He must be at work. His car is here. This is a logical certainty. He must be at work. His car is here. Should. This suggests expectation or advice. For example, she should arrive by 8 p.m. She is expected. She should arrive by 8 p.m. Ought to. Synonymous with should, but slightly more formal. Interesting. So ought to, it is synonymous with should, but slightly more formal. For example, she ought to arrive by 8 p.m. Could, used when there is a possibility but less certainty. For example, that could be her bag. I'm not certain. That could be her bag. So a tip for expressing probability: use must when you're confident and should or could for softer probabilities. So our probability tip: use must when you're confident and should or could for softer probabilities. So here's a real life situation. Checking on a friend. He should be home now. He texted me earlier. The speaker expects the friend to be home because they received a text earlier, which implies the friend's arrival or presence at home is likely. The use of should suggests a reasonable assumption rather than a certainty. He should be home now. He texted me later. Now, if it is certain, I would change it to he must be home now. He texted me earlier. This is stronger and implies a certainty. So these slight differences can change our understanding. Well, we have a chat exercise for you guys to complete. Let me read the instructions. Example at work. Complete with the correct modals. So there are 5 sentences there, 5 modal verbs to choose, one for each sentence. We've got must, ought to, could, should, and might. So if you want to participate, write the number of the sentence and the modal verb next to it into the chat as I read through these sentences. Number 1, Manager Anna. We complete this project by Friday. The client has made it clear that any delays are unacceptable. We complete this project by Friday. The client has made it clear that any delays are unacceptable. Which modal verb do you think that was? Must, ought to, could, should, or might? Number 2. Fred, I agree. We finalise the presentation slides today, so we have enough time to review them tomorrow. I agree. We finalise the presentation slides today, so we have enough time to review them tomorrow. So again, which one do you think? Put number 2 and choose a modal verb. Number 3, Bob. That's a good idea. We double check the data as well, just to make sure everything is accurate before the client presentation. Let's read that one again. Bob, that's a good idea. We double check the data as well, just to make sure everything is accurate before the client presentation. Let's have a look at number 4, Manager Anna. Absolutely. Also, we ask the marketing team for feedback on the design if we have time. Number 5, their input make the presentation more impactful. So numbers 4 and 5 again, I'll read them both together. Absolutely. Also, we ask the marketing team for feedback on the design if we have time. Their input make the presentation more impactful. Okay, well, we've had a couple of people go for number 1. They've used must. Okay, not had any other entries into the chat, but that's okay, guys. Well, we've got another one here. So 2, thank you very much. Could, 3, should, 4, ought to, and lastly, might. Okay, well, thank you very much for that. We're going to have a look. Let's see what the correct use of these is. Okay, so let me read through them and have a listen. We must complete this project by Friday. The client has made it clear that any delays are unacceptable. I agree, we should finalise the presentation slides today so we have enough time to review them tomorrow. That's a good idea. We ought to double check the data as well, just to make sure everything is accurate before the presentation. Okay, now should and ought to, these are used as suggestions and we can interchange them, of course. Number 4, absolutely. Also, we could ask the marketing team for feedback on the design if we have time. Their input might make the presentation more impactful. So those last two, a little bit less certain. We could ask the marketing team for feedback on the design if we have time. It's a conditional sentence. Their input might, it's possible, their input might make the presentation more impactful. The last sentence, expressing a possibility. Okay, well, it's just a nice exercise to have a look at how we can use them. So thank you very much for participating. Sometimes the use of modal verbs not as simple as we think, but let us continue with obligation. Okay, so we're now expressing the function of obligation. Modal verbs for obligation: must, have to. Explanation and usage. Must indicate strong obligation or necessity. Example, you must wear a helmet to be safe. Have to, often interchangeable with must. For an example, you have to wear a helmet as it is the law. But it has a more legal implication. So expressing obligation, we have a tip for this for you. Use have to for rules or laws and must for personal or internal obligations. So our tip is use have to for rules or laws and must for personal or internal obligations. So what is the key difference with must and have to? Must is an internal motivation or sense of personal duty. I feel I must do this. Have to is an external requirement imposed by rules, laws, or other authorities. I am required to do this. They are both obligation. Let's think of an example with must. Internal obligation. I must clock in by 9 a.m. every day because I want to set a good example for my team and stay disciplined. Explanation. Here, must reflects an internal obligation. The speaker feels a personal responsibility or inner motivation to follow the rule, driven by their own values or sense of duty. Now, an example with have to, external obligation. We have to clock in by 9 a.m. because it's the company policy and late arrivals will be reported to HR. Explanation. In this case, have to expresses an external obligation. The rule is imposed by the company and employees must comply due to external authority or consequences. So a slight difference between must and have to. Well, we're coming towards the end of our conference lesson today. Just going to read through our conclusions. So, in conclusion, modal verbs are essential tools for expressing possibility, probability, and obligation in English. They allow speakers to convey nuances of meaning, such as certainty, necessity, and suggestion, in both formal and informal contexts. Practicing these verbs in real life situations will help build confidence and fluency in everyday conversations and professional settings. There we go. Well, thank you once again, everybody, for attending today's conference lesson and for your participation in that chat exercise. There is just one more thing for me to do today, and that is to thank you for watching. On behalf of everyone at Cercle de Langues, once again, we appreciate your attendance and participation. Thank you ever so much. But it is time now to say goodbye. I will see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.